Hi everyone, thanks for signing into the webinar. I'm just going to leave it another minute or two just to allow a few extra names to join us today, and then we'll get going. Welcome everyone to today's Emsi webinar. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Anthony Horn. I am Managing Director for Emsi in APAC. And I'm delighted to be hosting today's webinar where we're going to explore the real employment outcomes of your graduates. And we're going to introduce some Emsi data that can help answer that question. As we're going through today's webinar, if you do have any questions, please do go ahead and ask those via the questions box in your control panel. And I'll get to those questions either as we go or at the end. And also you will receive a copy of today's webinar to refer back to and share with colleagues, etc. That will come through to you after today's broadcast. So then, what do I plan to cover off in the next 20 to 25 minutes? Firstly, a very quick introduction to Emsi for those of you who aren't already familiar with us. I'm going to introduce the Emsi Global Profiles data, which is the data that absolutely helps us to answer the question posed by this webinar. That is, what are the real employment outcomes of your graduates? I'll briefly mention why we think this is so important right now, and also a couple of things that clients in the higher education sector are telling us about why this is such an important thing to be aware of and an important thing to use data to help us with right now. Then we'll actually dig around into some of the data with some findings from recent work that we've done with both the University of Sydney and Monash data, as well as some anonymised data as well. So then, for those of you who don't already know us, Emsi is a labour market specialist, and we have a pretty simple mission. We want to help create better, more connected and more relevant labour markets in order to support economic prosperity. And we believe that we have very strong data that covers a lot of different aspects of the labour market that helps us to do that. We are a global company, headquartered in the United States of America and operating in various countries around the world. And in those countries, we look to connect three key audiences, those that you see on screen right now. So those that are looking for work, those that are looking to employ and progress good employees, and those like yourselves in education who are looking to build good study pathways and help students and individuals move through the labour market. Now, education, primarily higher education and also the vocational sector, has traditionally been Emsi's biggest market globally. And over 20 years of working with the education sector and many universities right around the world, just some of which you see mentioned on screen there, means that we're pretty adept at applying our various data sets and analytical expertise in order to help with the myriad of issues that are faced by yourselves and your peers in the wider higher education world. Now then, the data that I'm specifically referring to in today's webinar is the Emsi Global Profiles data. Now, this is a huge global data set. It's drawn from a number of different sources and then processed and deduplicated, etc. These sources are largely self-reported, coming from recruitment and networking services and systems, including professional networking websites and recruitment websites, and also information that is being directly submitted into recruitment systems and recruitment services. And the fact that it is from multiple sources is actually pretty important, as it means that the data is very rich and many more sectors and indeed many more individuals are included than some other sources of this kind of data. And also because it heavily incorporates recruitment specific data, then additional rich data sets are in there that we can include and use to our advantage. So that as a baseline, the Emsi Global Profiles data allows us to consider what we see on screen here. So where are graduates and individuals located? Who is employing them? In what job? What skills are they using? What skills are important to them in their career? What skills are proving valuable to the people who are employing them? What career pathway have they taken post-education? And a key data variable there is, of course, which university have they attended and which degree and or other qualification have they gained in that time. So then, why is this an important issue right now, and why does this data help? Well, firstly, here are just 3 things that our friends and clients in the higher education world have said to us recently, or have raised with us recently. And none of these will be a surprise to you, of course. Firstly, that there is constant pressure on universities across a number of different areas, whether that be external political funding debates, questions about return on investment that universities give, questions about and debates about fees and international students and student caps and all of the things that you're familiar with. Well, this data can play a part in helping to answer some of the questions that come out of that. At the same time, we all know that universities are operating in an ever competitive and growing marketplace. And students, likewise, are operating in an incredibly competitive market. They are now global assets in the workforce and the labour market, with the potential to work in a vast array of jobs right around the globe. And we, again, are all familiar with the debate around the changing nature of work and automation and how jobs are changing and appearing, and how individuals might have a number of different careers and a number of different skill requirements throughout their career. And of course, at the same time, students above all want to know the answer to the question, why should I attend your university? What's in it for me? What have other people who have done what I want to do ended up doing in their careers? Have they been successful? Do they have the kind of job that I want? Do they work for the kind of employer that I want to work for in the location that I want to work for? And these are questions that the Emsi Global Profile data can help you to answer. And then three things from our perspective, from the sort of data side of things, that sort of demonstrate in introduction some of the real added value that this data brings. Firstly, the data that we're going to look at gives a longer term, longitudinal view. So it's not just looking at, for example, 3 months post-graduation, what are your graduates doing? This is a longer term view. And typically, given the source of this data and the work that we do on it, it typically allows us to focus on graduates from your institution from over the last 10 to 15 years. The richness of this data allows you to compare yourselves to others in a number of different ways, which we'll look at shortly, which allows you to really pull out the areas that you're doing very well in. So to highlight your competitive advantages across a number of different variables. And both of those things really aren't something that other similar data sources allow you to do. I mentioned earlier the student outcomes survey and employment outcomes survey will give you a view of what's happening in a short-term snapshot. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to give you that bigger picture. And also mentioned earlier, some of the data sets might have a preponderance towards particular sectors or particular individuals. We try and mitigate that by drawing in data from a number of different sources. And with all of that in mind, the use cases that you're seeing on here, again, I'm sure one was a huge surprise to you. But it is that the Emsi data is not intended to replace a service or replace something that you're already doing. Most usually, what we find is that the data really adds value and adds richness to the work that yourselves and colleagues are already doing, whether that be in recruitment, course and portfolio development, and spotting the skills that are needed for successful work, whether it be work with specific departments and specific employers, or whatever it may be. The Emsi Global Profile data is about adding value. So let's jump into the data. Let's explore some of it and some of its possibilities, and hopefully understand a little bit more about what it can do and how it might be of interest to you at your institution. So firstly, we can look at geographic destinations. Where exactly do your graduates end up? And what we see on screen here is a headline finding from, in this case, an anonymized piece of analysis that we did in Australia. And this particular client wanted to start very much from first principles, which this next couple of slides will show us. And one of the questions they had was, where do our graduates, where do our alumni who remain in Australia actually end up living and working? So we see that headline finding on screen right now, and as you look at that, you probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that this was a university based in New South Wales. However, the most important takeaway from this snapshot was that many of the graduates from this university remained in very, very close proximity to the location of their study and the location of the university, which actually didn't chime with what the university anecdotally felt. So they probably thought they had a bigger spread of destination geographically, which then, of course, begged the question, is this the same for not just all of the university graduates, which is what we're seeing on screen here, but what about different degree areas? What about different departments? do we have different patterns of geographic destination for different subjects? Because that's something we probably need to know a little bit about and need to understand a bit better. And that is something that we were able to look into. So pretty much all of what I'm talking about today can be done at both an aggregate university level, but of course also at a more granular level, whether that be by department or some other form of cutting the data that you would like us to do. Next example, for that same anonymised university, they were interested in knowing sort of how they compared in terms of graduates spread across different career areas. So we've looked at the volume of their profiles, so the volume of graduates working in the labour force across Australia. And then we looked at the concentration, so how did they compare in both overall volume terms, but also in concentration or proportion of the workforce. And what we see on screen here is that both nationally and from this sample university, the majority of graduates are now working in management careers. But actually the volume and proportion from this particular university has a concentration of 1, which essentially means that that proportion is the same as every other university in Australia. So nothing particularly special. Whereas if we even look at their second largest supply into the Australian labour force, marketing and PR, we actually see that this university actually provides a much larger proportion of that workforce than other universities. In fact, about 30% more, which again beg the question from this university, why is that? Let's look at individuals coming out of various courses, and in fact individuals going into marketing and PR roles, and find out what it is that we as a university are offering them as a competitive advantage, because we certainly seem to be supplying that particular career area very well and very strongly. Now, this next slide is actually from a large study we did over in the US, where we looked at liberal arts graduates from all US institutions, and we tracked the types of jobs that they ended up getting first, second and third in their career. Now, there's absolutely loads of fantastic, interesting insight in that report that we did. And the good news is that I will share it with you all after today's webinar. But a highlight from that data, and what we see on screen here visually represented, is that a lot of liberal arts grads were ending up in high skill, high demand jobs in, again, marketing and PR, and were in fact gravitating away from low wage jobs as they progressed through their career, which was a really interesting insight and a unique lens on liberal arts grads that hasn't really been looked at in detail before. Next, let's look at some actual real-life named analysis that we've done over in Australia. And firstly, some analysis that we have done with Monash data. So for a specific section of their provision, we looked here at who employs their graduates. And what we saw and what we see on screen is quite a broad spread of sectors and individual employees coming out, which again, we are then able to dig more into. What are the jobs that individuals are doing and what are the skills that are required by these employers? And we can, in fact, boil that down. So again, for a particular section of Monash University graduates, what were the top, or what are the top skills that graduates are using and reporting as they progress through the labour market. Firstly, we can see here what are sometimes referred to as the top soft skills. And then more specific named skills. And both of those things have proven to be very useful for clients to understand what are the broad cross-cutting themes, such as leadership and management and mentoring, and then what are some of the more specific skills that are being asked in the labour force by those that employ our graduates, and what are those skills that our graduates are reporting as being important and useful to them at a more granular level, which can obviously help in a number of different functions within the university, whether that be development of portfolio, development of new courses, whether it be direct work with students, recruitment, whether it be direct work with employees in industry. Now, the final aspect of the Emsi Global Profile data that I want to introduce on today's webinar is actually the most complex from a data point of view, but in many ways it's the most exciting and innovative. Cluster analysis allows us to do is to understand the types of jobs and the type of work that your graduates are getting, rather than just looking at the job title. So that allows us to move away from, or to understand differently, the types of work that your graduates are getting that isn't really represented by traditional occupational classifications or traditional job titles even. And skills clustering takes a bottom-up approach, so it allows us to consider skills as the primary driver in understanding the types of work and the types of jobs that individuals, your graduates, are doing. So we can understand the common skills that are being held and used by your graduates, types of work that they're doing, and how do they differ even from those that have done the same type of degree. So, for example, are individuals from your engineering degrees doing different types of work, and what are the different skills that are coalescing around those different types of work, and what does that tell you about what you guys are delivering to them in their engineering degree, as an example. Now, here is an example of skills clustering analysis from work that we recently completed for the University of Sydney. Now, as I mentioned, it's pretty complex data, so I won't kind of dwell on it for too long and try and explain the full ins and outs of it. But for a description, what we see on screen is a graphic demonstrating some skills clustering analysis. In this example, this is graduates from their accounting degrees who typically ended up working in various professional services firms. Now, on screen, along the horizontal axis, we see how common a skill is in their graduates. So how commonly a skill is appearing, how frequently a skill is appearing in their graduates' professional profiles and recruitment information. And then on the vertical axis, we see how specific that skill is to this particular career grouping. So again, I mentioned we're looking here at graduates from their accounting degrees, their accounting portfolio, who ended up in specific jobs in the investment space with professional services firms. And what this particular skills analysis showed was that lots of University of Sydney accounting graduates were specialising in jobs that required very technical, specifically named skills around equities and risk and derivatives and some of the very, very specific stuff that was relevant and important to employers in the Sydney area for graduates coming out of these degrees. And this has proved to be vitally useful to the delivery team to begin with, because they understand that they need to very much focus their existing delivery on these skills and also their ongoing course development and course content development on these skills that are proving very, very important to graduates and important to the employers of those graduates. But also it's really, really useful information for the university marketing and careers and advancement teams, because this, as well as the additional cluster analysis that we did right across the university, allows them to talk to their students about the kind of skills that they will pick up as they study at the university and why that is proving to be very helpful and useful to graduates who are now working in those jobs within the Sydney and wider Australian market. So that's an initial introduction to the Emsi Global Profile data and an introduction as to the various ways in which it can be used to help you better understand the answer to that question about the real employment outcomes of your graduates. Now, hopefully that has piqued your interest somewhat, and the things, some or all of the things that are appearing on screen right now are similar to what might be running through your head and some of the possibilities that might be running through your head right now. Now, if so, I'd absolutely love to pick this conversation up with you individually, and I know that I'm doing that very shortly with some of you who are joining us today on today's webinar, but I'd love to talk to you all and connect with you all and understand how the data and the application of the data, more importantly, can be useful to the work that you do at your university. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, you will receive a copy of today's content. And I also will share the liberal arts study from the US that I referenced in the webinar. So you'll receive those shortly. Now, in the meantime, thanks very much for joining me on today's Emsi webinar. And I do very much look forward to speaking to you all again soon.